The Punisher is a third-person action-adventure game that was published by THQ for the PlayStation 2, Xbox and Windows PC in 2005. And this game would be a direct add-on from the popular movie that starred Thomas Jane and John Travolta in 2004. And Thomas Jane would reprise his role of doing the voiceover for Frank Castle as the Punisher in the game, which added to the whole kind of aesthetic that the game was going for, which was pretty cool. And for me personally, I'm a big fan of the Punisher series, and the Punisher is one of my favourite Marvel characters of all time. And the story of this game, it follows on from certain elements of the actual film, but it bases itself around certain sections of the storybooks or comic book series that features many cameos from other iconic Marvel characters such as Iron Man, Nick Fury, Black Widow, Matt Murdock, or otherwise known as Daredevil, and other enemies with Bushwhacker, Kingpin, Bullseye, the Russian, and many other characters that would have been in the movie as well. So again, like following on from the film, the Punisher then goes through the progress of, again, taking out various criminal overlords and underworld kind of criminals to rid the streets of crime, while telling its own individual story aside from the actual movie. And the game does tell a really good story. It has great voice acting and it has a really good atmosphere. Although, even though it has many unique elements, the game did receive mixed reviews and was criticised for certain elements, more to the point with the linear and repetitive style gameplay, as the levels themselves, there's not really much in terms of exploration and there's not really any backtracking, so it's just literally point A to point B and that's it, so progress through the story. But where this game got most of its attention is there was so much controversy around the game, as this game is, without a doubt, even by today, is considered to be one of the most controversial games in existence, as it's also one of the most gruesome and brutal games and most violent games that you could ever play, as many of the rating systems in different countries at first were struggling to allow the Punisher to be released within the regions, so the developers had to use different tricks and they had to work alongside of these departments to kind of refrain from showing all of the death scenes or torture scenes in full visual effect. So they had to use subtle instances or tricks to move away so that you wouldn't really see what was going on, as this is a very violent game. It has your typical kind of stance of gunplay and hand-to-hand combat that you would see in other types of action-adventure games, but where this game really takes off is in its torture settings, when you use different environmental elements in order to interrogate enemies, and you have the ability to either let them live or literally execute them or assassinate them. And some of the methods used in the game are some of the most brutal that you could ever even imagine, using from the likes of drills to knocking people out windows, using car crushers to, well, you guess that, you can imagine yourself. I can't even explain it, but let's just put it this way, this game is very graphic in how it depicts its violence, let's just put it that way. The only other game on the PS2 that even matches this in terms of its violent nature would be the Manhunt series. Now there are other games out there, there's a lot of violent games that would be seen even on modern consoles, but very few games have ever been able to depict the violent nature in ways that this game and even Manhunt does. So that's why there was so much controversy surrounding it. But then that appeals to the whole dynamic of the Punisher character, because that's the way he portrays how he does things, because he literally takes and eliminates criminals and he uses any means possible in order to do it. But from a gameplay standpoint, the game plays and feels very like if you've ever played Max Payne. Now for me, Max Payne is, without a doubt, in my own personal opinion, I'm a huge fan of Max Payne, and I put it down in one of my top 5 favourite games of all time, especially the first game. I absolutely love that game. It has great cutscenes, great use of like the comic book style segments to tell stories, fantastic voice acting, just great well written story, great action sequences, even the use of the slow motion kind of Matrix style slow-mo bullet time effects, which was phenomenal. This game utilises many of those elements, but it doesn't have the bullet time. That's the only difference. But it plays and feels very, very like Max Payne in terms of how it portrays itself, but it just would be not as fleshed out or refined. It would just be a little bit more on the clunkier side, but it's still a very good game in its own right. So much so that I bought the PlayStation version, or the PS2 version, when it first came out back in 2005, and I enjoyed it that much. And like with Max Payne, because I had the PS2 version as well, a few months later I also went out and bought the PC version because I wanted to experience it from playing on the PC but using the keyboard and mouse, because I know from my own experience playing first person shooters, now I know control systems have adapted and they have gotten better with controllers, especially on consoles over recent years. But back during that time, control systems on first-person shooters were still kind of tricky, and they weren't as refined as they are today, even during the mid-2000s. So these style of games, while they did play okay, they were better suited to a PC style of setup. Because I remember going back to playing games like Half-Life and other types of 3D shooters or first-person shooters on the PC, like Deus Ex and a load of those other ones, and they were phenomenal to play on the PC. But the console ports, although they were good, the control systems, because of the controller layouts, somewhat let the experience down somewhat. So I wanted to experience the game from a whole different perspective, playing it with the PC. And like with Max Payne, like I do love the PS2 version, but for me, PC version of Max Payne is the definitive version. Actually, both the Max Payne games are, the definitive version on the PC. And the same can be said for the PC version of the Punisher. Using the controls and the buttons and the mouse to direct and to engage in combat and stuff, it's far better on the PC. It just is so much more fluent, it's so much more responsive than using that as the controller. Because the controller can still be a bit finicky and fiddly in terms of how it plays out, because it can still be quite clunky, but you won't have that problem if you're used to using gameplay or PC style controls. So in saying that, even though I love the PS2 version, if I was to pick or even recommend a version of the game to play, either with the Punisher or even Max Payne like I mentioned, because they are very similar in terms of how to play, I would go for the PC version. Now mind you, it all depends on modern systems and whether you could get the games to run on modern systems, because that can be quite difficult. But even at that, they're still phenomenal. But if you can't get access to them, then play them on the PS2. This here game, even though it got mixed reviews, I still consider this to be one of the best games I played on the PS2. It just is a really good game, and it's definitely one of the most brutal games you could ever play. But then you see, I'm a fan of the Punisher. I'm even a fan of the more recent TV series that was on Netflix a few years back, and just the general premise of the character, very dark and gritty, and I just think it's brilliant. And the game captures that atmosphere down to a T. It captured all of the elements that made the movie really good back in the day, and even more so in the game. It's very dark in its tone, it's very gritty, it's kind of got like a noir kind of style vibe going on, and it just is really, really good. And again, it's extremely brutal in terms of its violence. Very few games are able to represent it in the way that this game does, let's just put it that way. It's crazy what this game does. That's all I'll say about that. You'll have to experience it for yourself, that's the one thing I'll say. This is an excellent game, no ifs or buts about it, regardless of its flaws. If you genuinely like action games, and if you're a fan of the Punisher, you have to play this game if you haven't played it already. And I would love to know your thoughts on this game, if you have played it, and what do you think of it in general, or even which version of the game did you enjoy the most, or which would you prefer? Like myself, would you prefer the PC version over the PS2, or the other way around? I would love to know what thoughts you do have of this game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell to be updated of future videos. And if you would like to see more videos on other types of action adventure games similar to this that were also released on the PS2, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And I will see you all in the next one.
Tell me about you and the Nucci's, Duca.
I was just dropping Bobby's name. I don't know nothing about him. Whoa!